There's a certain kind of quiet that you can only find deep in the woods, far away from the incessant hum of civilization. It's not an absence of sound, but rather a different kind of sound altogether. The gentle symphony of nature, the rustle of leaves in the wind, the distant call of a loon, the soft lapping of water against the shore. This is the quiet I had sought. The quiet I had found in my small cabin in rural upstate New York. I had moved here 5 years ago, a self-imposed exile from the chaotic, claustrophobic confines of New York City. The cabin itself was nothing fancy, a simple wooden structure with a large deck that overlooked a sprawling, untamed forest. My nearest neighbor was miles away, a fact that I considered to be one of the property's greatest assets. My days were spent in a state of peaceful solitude. I was a fisherman, and the lake that bordered my property was my sanctuary. I would spend hours out on the water, my line cast, my mind blissfully empty. I wasn't lonely. I was alone, and there is a profound difference between the two. The evenings were my favorite time. I would sit on my deck, a cold beer in my hand, and watch as the sun bled into the horizon, painting the sky in fiery hues of orange and purple. As darkness fell, the woods would come alive with a new set of sounds, a chorus of crickets and frogs that was both soothing and mysterious. For 5 years, this was my paradise. And then, the peace was shattered. It began subtly, almost imperceptibly. About 2 weeks ago, I was on my deck, engaged in my nightly ritual of quiet contemplation, when I heard it, a sharp, distinct snap of a twig from deep within the woods. My first thought was of a deer, or perhaps a clumsy raccoon. The forest was teeming with wildlife, and I was accustomed to the sounds of their nocturnal wanderings. I dismissed it without a second thought. But as the days passed, the sounds became more frequent, more insistent. The rustling of leaves grew louder, the snapping of twigs more deliberate. They were still sounds that could be attributed to animals, but a sliver of unease had begun to wedge itself into my consciousness. Then, one night, the nature of the sound changed. It was a scratching, a dry, abrasive sound that seemed to be coming from the side of the house, near the window of the spare bedroom. It was a quiet, furtive sound, almost as if it was trying not to be heard. I stood up from my chair, my heart giving a slight, nervous flutter. I listened, my ears straining in the darkness, but the sound did not repeat itself. Probably just a squirrel, I told myself, but the explanation felt hollow, unconvincing. An inexplicable sense of wrongness had settled over me, a feeling that I was no longer alone. I went inside, the comforting click of the deadbolt doing little to soothe my frayed nerves. The following evening, the scratching returned. It was louder this time, more persistent, and it was closer. It sounded like it was coming from right outside the spare bedroom window. I froze, my hand hovering over my beer bottle, my breath catching in my throat. This was not a squirrel. This was something else. A cold knot of fear began to form in the pit of my stomach. I crept over to the window, my bare feet silent on the wooden floor, with trembling fingers. I pulled back the edge of the curtain and peered out into the darkness. The moonlight cast long, eerie shadows across the yard, transforming the familiar landscape into something alien and menacing. The trees stood like silent, skeletal sentinels, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers, but there was nothing there. No animal, no person, just the empty, silent woods. I let the curtain fall back into place, my reflection in the dark glass, a pale, wide-eyed stranger. I tried to reason with myself, to rationalize the fear away. It was a branch, I told myself, brushing against the siding in the wind. My imagination, fueled by the isolation, was getting the better of me. I went to bed that night, but sleep was a long time coming. The scratching came back the next night, but it was different now. It was accompanied by a light, rhythmic tapping on the window pane, like someone gently knocking to get my attention. My heart leaped into my throat. I jumped out of bed, my mind a chaotic swirl of fear and disbelief. I grabbed the heavy maglite I kept on my nightstand and crept down the dark hallway, my knuckles white as I gripped the cold metal. When I reached the spare bedroom, I took a deep breath and flung back the curtain, shining the bright beam of the flashlight into the yard. Nothing. The yard was empty, the woods beyond silent and still, but the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. The air in the room felt thick, heavy, charged with a malevolent energy that I couldn't explain. The nights that followed were a living hell. The sounds became a nightly occurrence, a relentless assault on my sanity. The scratching, the tapping, sometimes even a faint sibilant whisper that seemed to emanate from within the walls of the cabin itself. I tried to ignore it, to drown it out with music, with the television, but it was always there, a persistent, terrifying reminder that I was not alone. My peaceful sanctuary had become a prison, and I was its only inmate. One night I decided that I couldn't take it anymore. I had to confront whatever was tormenting me. I armed myself with a crowbar from the shed, the heavy iron bar, a cold, reassuring weight in my hand. If it was an animal, a raccoon or a possum that had found its way into the walls, I would deal with it. I unlocked the door to the spare bedroom and pushed it open. The air inside was stale and musty, the room having been unused For months, I swept the beam of my flashlight across the room, illuminating dusty furniture and cobweb-strewn corners. I checked under the bed, behind the dresser, in every conceivable hiding place. Nothing. I stood in the center of the room, feeling foolish, the crowbar hanging limply at my side. It was just an empty room. I was losing my mind. But as I turned to leave, something caught my eye. The closet door was slightly ajar. I froze, a cold dread washing over me. I never left the closet door open. I approached it slowly, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I pulled the door open and shone my flashlight inside. The closet was empty, save for a few old boxes and a dusty set of winter clothes. But as the beam of light danced across the back wall, it illuminated something small, something out of place. A small scrap of dark, torn cloth was snagged on a nail in the wall. It looked like a piece of a shirt or a jacket. My breath hitched in my throat. My mind, which had, when struggling to find a rational explanation, was suddenly flooded with a terrifying certainty. Someone had been in this room. Someone had been inside my house. I backed out of the room, my hand shaking so violently that the beam of the flashlight danced manically on the walls. I slammed the door shut and bolted it, my mind reeling. I couldn't stay in the house, not another second. I stumbled outside, the cold night air a shock to my system. The darkness of the woods, once a source of comfort, now felt menacing, oppressive. I spent the rest of the night on the couch, a baseball bat clutched in my hands, my eyes wide open, listening, but the house remained silent. The next night I tried to be brave. I was determined not to be driven out of my own home. I went to my bedroom, the baseball bat leaning against the nightstand, and tried to sleep. But just as I was drifting into a restless, shallow slumber, I heard it again, tap, 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 against the spare bedroom window. A surge of adrenaline shot through me. I grabbed the flashlight and ran down the hallway, my fear eclipsed by a sudden, reckless anger. I flung back the curtain, ready to confront whatever was out there, and I saw it, a shadow, a tall, slender figure standing just outside the window, its form barely visible in the dim moonlight. I saw it for only a second before it melted back into the darkness of the woods, but the image was burned into my retinas. I stumbled back, my blood running cold. It was real. Someone had been watching me. Someone had been toying with me, terrorizing me, for weeks. I ran to the phone, my hands shaking so much that I could barely dial 911. My voice was a panicked, breathless whisper as I explained the situation to the operator. She assured me that help was on the way. I hung up the phone and looked around the room, a frantic, desperate need to escape consuming me. But as I turned to grab my jacket, I heard a sound from the hallway. A slow, deliberate creak of a floorboard. Someone was in the house. I didn't hesitate. I ran for the back door, flinging it open and plunging into the cold, dark woods. I ran with a desperation I had never known, the branches of the trees clawing at my face and clothes. I didn't look back. I didn't dare. By the time I reached the edge of my property, I could see the flashing red and blue lights of the police cars approaching in the distance. I hid behind a large oak tree, my body trembling, and watched as the officers swarmed the cabin, their guns drawn. I didn't wait to see what they found. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the very marrow of my bones, that I could never go back. The cabin, my once peaceful sanctuary, was now a monument to my terror. And somewhere out there, in the deep dark woods, the Watcher was still waiting. The arrangement was, on paper, perfect. At 22, the desire for independence gnawed at me with a persistent, dull ache. Yet the financial reality of city life was a bucket of ice water to the face. My parents, in a gesture of both support and perhaps a subtle desire to keep me tethered to the nest, offered me the downstairs apartment of our house. It was a self-contained unit, a relic from a time when the house had been a two-family dwelling. Renting it from them allowed me to save a significant chunk of my meager salary while affording me a semblance of the privacy I so desperately craved. The main house and the apartment were connected by a single lockable door at the bottom of an internal staircase, a flimsy barrier that was more symbolic than secure. My space was a sprawling open-planned layout. A compact kitchenette bled into a generous living area dominated by a massive, comfortable couch. A short hallway led to my bedroom, a bathroom, and a small laundry room. A separate side entrance gave me direct access to the outside world, a feature I cherished despite the theoretical privacy. The proximity to my parents was a constant, low-level hum of awareness. They were good people, but their presence was a silent curfew, a subtle pressure that prevented me from truly feeling like the master of my own domain. Having friends over felt like a clandestine operation, and the idea of bringing a girl back was fraught with a paralyzing awkwardness. So, when they announced they were going away for a long weekend, a wave of liberating relief washed over me. The house would be mine. The silence, the space, the freedom, it was all I could think about. That Friday night, I wasted no time in christening my temporary kingdom. My two closest friends, Anthony and Jay, came over. The plan was simple: good music, cold drinks, and a hockey game. With my parents gone, the volume knob on the stereo was cranked to a level that would normally have elicited a stern text message from my dad. We sprawled on the couch, the television flickering with the fast-paced action of the game, the air thick with the easy camaraderie of old friends. I kept the door to the upstairs unlocked, a small act of rebellion. The main refrigerator upstairs was larger and more efficient than my mini-fridge, so it became our designated beverage depot. As the night wore on, the initial excitement mellowed into a comfortable alcohol-induced haze. I wasn't blackout drunk, but a pleasant buzz had settled in, softening the edges of the world. By the time the final buzzer of the game sounded, it was late, and the prospect of Anthony and Jay driving home was out of the question. My couch, a behemoth of upholstery and cushions, could easily accommodate them both. After a final round of laughter and slurred goodbyes, I stumbled down the hall to my bedroom, leaving them to the vast expanse of the living room. The transition from the fuzzy warmth of sleep to the cold, stark awareness of being awake was jarring. The digital clock on my nightstand glowed with an accusatory red 3:17 a.m. The house was shrouded in the profound silence of the early morning hours, a silence that made every sound feel amplified and significant. And there was a sound. It was what had dragged me from my dreams' footsteps. They were coming from directly above me, from the main floor of the house. The floorboards creaked with a slow, deliberate rhythm. The sound of someone pacing in the upstairs kitchen. My initial reaction was a groggy annoyance, not fear. It had to be Anthony or Jay. The unlocked door, the bigger fridge, the logic was sound. They probably got thirsty and went upstairs for a cold bottle of water or a leftover soda. I rolled over, pulling the covers tighter around my shoulders, willing myself back to sleep. It was a perfectly reasonable explanation, and my sleep-addled brain clung to it. I closed my eyes, focusing on the rhythmic pattern of my own breathing, but the footsteps continued, a persistent, unwelcome intrusion into the stillness of the night. Then, another sound, closer this time, made my eyes snap open. It was the sound of my bedroom doorknob. A soft, metallic click, followed by a slow, tentative twist. Someone was trying to open my door. My heart, which had been beating with a lazy, sleepy rhythm, gave a sudden, violent lurch. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing. It was locked. I always locked my bedroom door, a habit ingrained in me since childhood, a small ritual of security that I performed without conscious thought. But why would Anthony or Jay be trying to get into my room? It made no sense. A wave of irritation washed over my initial shock. What could they possibly want at this hour? I was exhausted, and the thought of engaging in a drunken, middle-of-the-night conversation was deeply unappealing. I remained perfectly still, my breathing shallow, my ears straining in the darkness. I decided that silence was my best strategy. If I pretended to be asleep, they would eventually give up and go back to the couch. It was a strange, passive-aggressive response, born more out of a desire to avoid confrontation than any real sense of danger. To my immense relief, it worked. The gentle pressure on the doorknob ceased, and a few moments later I heard the faint sound of footsteps retreating down the hallway. The house fell silent once more. The adrenaline that had surged through me began to recede, replaced by a profound weariness. Against all odds, I drifted back to sleep, the unsettling incident already fading into the murky realm of a half-remembered dream. The next morning, the sun streamed through my window, burning away the shadows of the night. The apartment was quiet. When I emerged from my room, I found Jay still asleep on the couch, a blanket pulled up to his chin. Anthony was gone, likely having woken up early and left without wanting to disturb us. The smell of stale beer hung in the air. As I opened the fridge to find something to drink, the movement stirred Jay. He sat up, rubbing his eyes and groaning softly. "Morning," I said, my voice hoarse. "Ugh," he replied, which was a fairly standard morning after greeting for him. "Hey, quick question," I began, trying to sound casual. "Were you trying to get into my room last night?" He looked at me, his brow furrowed in confusion. "What? No, I don't think so. I was pretty out of it, man. I don't remember much after the game." His denial was convincing, but his admitted drunkenness left a sliver of doubt. We didn't dwell on it. The pressing need for coffee and greasy food overshadowed everything else. We walked to a nearby deli, the crisp morning air a welcome antidote to our hangovers. Over bacon, egg, and cheese sandwiches in my backyard, we dissected the previous night's hockey game, the mysterious incident in the hallway all but forgotten. Jay left soon after, and I was alone again. I didn't bother texting Anthony to ask him about the doorknob. It felt trivial, an insignificant detail in the grand scheme of things. I spent the rest of the day out of the house, meeting up with other friends, trying to soak up as much of my temporary freedom as I could. I returned home late that Saturday night, weary but sober. The day had been a marathon of social engagements, and the effects of the previous night's drinking had long since worn off. The house was dark and silent as I let myself in. The quiet felt different this time, heavier, more profound. I had a quick snack, washed up, and retreated to the comfort of my bed. I wasn't ready for sleep just yet, so I propped myself up against the pillows and turned on the TV. the low volume a stark contrast to the previous night's raucousness. After an hour or so, my eyelids grew heavy. I turned off the TV, plunging the room into darkness. And that's when I heard it again. The sound was almost identical to the night before, a series of soft creaks and thumps from the floor above, directly over my head. It sounded like footsteps, slow and measured, pacing back and forth in the upstairs kitchen. But this time there was no logical explanation. Anthony and Jay were gone. My parents weren't due back until Monday. The house should have been empty. I sat bolt upright in bed, my heart beginning to hammer against my ribs. I strained my ears, listening with an intensity that made the silence between the sounds almost deafening. The footsteps stopped as suddenly as they had begun. I held my breath, waiting, my mind racing through a Rolodex of possibilities. Was it just the house settling? Old houses make strange noises, I told myself. It was a comforting thought, a rational explanation that I desperately wanted to believe. My mind, prone to paranoia in the dead of night, was probably amplifying the sounds, twisting them into something they weren't. I took a deep, shuddering breath and laid back down, forcing my muscles to relax. It was nothing. I was being ridiculous. You should have trusted my gut. My initial surge of fear was a primal warning, a signal that my subconscious had picked up on something that my rational mind was trying to dismiss. And then, it happened again. The sound that turned my blood to ice. The doorknob to my bedroom door began to move. It wasn't a tentative jiggle this time. It was a firm, deliberate twist, the sound of someone trying to force their way in. I shot up in bed so fast that the room spun for a moment. This time there was a follow-up. A light, almost delicate knock on the door, a polite little rap that was so grotesquely out of place that a wave of nausea washed over me. Silence, utter complete silence. I didn't breathe. I didn't move. I was a statue carved from fear. My phone was on the bed beside me. It screened a beacon of hope in the suffocating darkness. With trembling fingers, I grabbed it, my thumb fumbling with the keypad. I typed out a frantic, garbled message and sent it to my family's group chat, and then to Anthony and Jay. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that it wasn't one of my friends. But a desperate, irrational part of me hoped for a reply, a text message that would magically explain away the terror that was consuming me. Yeah man, it's me. I forgot my wallet. Anything. Minutes stretched into an eternity. My messages remained unanswered. My parents were asleep, hundreds of miles away. My friends were at their own homes, oblivious to my plight. The thought of calling out, of saying who's there, was terrifying. What if they answered? That silence was a fragile shield, and I was afraid of what would happen if I broke it. My survival instinct, long dormant, finally kicked in. I slipped out of bed, my feet making no sound on the carpeted floor. My eyes darted around the room, searching for a weapon, for a place to hide. I grabbed a heavy glass paperweight from my desk, its weight a small comfort in my trembling hand. I squeezed myself into the narrow space between my dresser and the wall, a corner of the room that was not visible from the door. If they kicked the door down, they would likely rush towards the bed. It was a small, pathetic plan, but it was all I had. I crouched there, the paperweight clutched in my white-knuckled fist, my back pressed against the cold wall. I counted the seconds, each one a lifetime. 5 minutes, 10 minutes. The silence stretched on, thin and taut, like a wire about to snap. There were no more knocks, no more attempts on the doorknob, but the presence was still there. I could feel it, a heavy, malevolent energy that seemed to seep through the very walls of the house. I couldn't stay there, cowering in the dark, waiting for something to happen. I had to do something. With my free hand, I unlocked my phone and dialed 911. My voice, when I finally found it, was a barely audible whisper. I explained the situation to the operator, my words tumbling out in a torrent of fear and panic. She spoke to me in a calm, steady voice, her words a lifeline in the churning sea of my terror. She told me to stay on the line, that officers were on their way. The thought of opening the bedroom door, of walking through the apartment to the side entrance, was unbearable. I can't leave the room, I whispered, my eyes fixed on the door. Can you tell them to come to my bedroom window? The operator relayed the message. The next few minutes were the longest of my life. I remained crouched in my hiding spot, the phone pressed to my ear, listening to the comforting, disembodied voice of the operator. And then, a new sound, a gentle tap on the window pane. I scrambled over to the window and peered out, the reassuring sight of a uniformed police officer, his face illuminated by the soft glow of his flashlight, greeted me. I slid the window open, a wave of relief so powerful it almost made me buckle. The key to the side door is on the kitchen counter, I whispered. He nodded and disappeared from view. A few moments later, I heard the sound of the side entrance opening, followed by the firm, authoritative voices of the police. It was only then that I dared to leave the safety of my bedroom. I emerged into the hallway, my heart still pounding in my chest, and was met by 2 officers. I flicked on every light switch I could find, flooding the apartment with a harsh, unflattering light that chased away the shadows. The apartment was small and a quick search revealed nothing out of the ordinary. He must have gone upstairs, I said, my voice trembling. The officers exchanged a look, then nodded. We proceeded up the narrow staircase, our footsteps echoing in the cavernous silence of the main house. The upstairs was a mirror image of the downstairs, only larger and more elegantly furnished. We moved from room to room, the officers' movements, methodical and efficient. I pointed out each room, my voice a nervous tremor. That's the guest room. That's my parents' office. We reached my parents' bedroom. One of the officers pushed the door open and stepped inside, his partner close behind. For about 30 seconds there was silence. Then, a sudden commotion, a muffled shout, the sound of a struggle. I was standing in the hallway, my stomach twisting into a tight, painful knot. I crept forward and peeked into the room. The sight that met my eyes will be seared into my memory for the rest of my life. The two officers were yelling at someone, their voices sharp and commanding. They were pointing their guns at my parents' bed, and from underneath the bed, a pair of grimy, bare feet were slowly emerging. I was ushered downstairs, my mind reeling, unable to process what I had just seen. A few minutes later, the officers descended the stairs, and between them was a man. He was tall and gaunt, his face covered in a thick layer of dirt and grime. He was wearing a filthy sweatshirt and a pair of tattered shorts. Despite the chill in the air, his eyes, wild and feral, darted around the room before they landed on me. He stared at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated hatred, a look so malevolent that it made me physically recoil. "Do you know this man?" one of the officers asked. "No," I choked out. "Of course not." The man was escorted out of the house and placed in the back of a patrol car. The officers told me that he was likely homeless and had been seeking shelter from the cold. They gave me a case number and told me that my parents could follow up with the precinct if they wished to press charges. After they left, the silence that descended upon the house was more terrifying than any of the noises that had preceded it. I sent a long, frantic text to my family and friends, the words a jumbled mess of fear and relief. The next morning I called my parents and recounted the horrifying events of the past 2 nights. They were shocked and horrified, but ultimately, they decided not to press charges. The man was homeless, and nothing had been stolen. It seemed like a compassionate, if not slightly naive, decision. The police theorized that I had likely left the front door unlocked on the night Anthony and Jay came over, and the man had simply walked in while we were blasting music, his entrance masked by the noise. He had then hidden in the house, waiting for us to fall asleep. But another, more terrifying thought occurred to me, a thought that has haunted me ever since. What if he had been in the house for much longer than that? Days, even weeks. A silent, unseen tenant, living in the shadows, waiting for the right to make his presence known. The house, once a symbol of comfort and security, was now a place of profound and enduring horror. I moved out a week later, unable to shake the feeling that I was constantly being watched, unable to sleep without the image of that man's hateful stare burning itself into the back of my eyelids. The year was 2008, a time before smartphones were ubiquitous, a time when AOL Instant Messenger was the primary mode of teenage communication. I was 15, and like most 15-year-olds, I cherished the rare moments when I had the house to myself. My parents, in a rare display of spontaneity, had decided to go to the casino for the night, leaving me in charge of the house and our good-natured black Labrador, Abby. The evening began, as most of my solo evenings did, with me parked in front of the family computer, the glow of the monitor illuminating my face as I chatted with friends and fell down the rabbit hole of early YouTube. It was around 11 p.m. when the first sign of trouble appeared. Abby, who had been dozing peacefully at my feet, suddenly shot up and began to bark, a series of sharp, insistent yaps directed at the living room. My initial thought was that my parents were home early. I waited, expecting to hear the familiar sound of the front door opening, the jingle of keys, my mother's voice calling my name. But the barking continued, and the house remained silent. With a sigh of annoyance, I got up from the computer and went to investigate. I found Abby standing in the middle of the living room, her body tense, her gaze fixed on the large picture window that looked out onto our driveway. She was still barking a low, guttural sound that was uncharacteristically aggressive for her. The living room was dark, and the only light came from the street lamp at the end of our driveway, casting long, eerie shadows across the lawn. I peeked through the window, but all I could see was my mom's car, a solitary sentinel in the empty driveway. My dad's car was gone, which meant they were still at the casino. I tried to soothe Abby, to reassure her that there was nothing to be afraid of. I chalked it up to a passing car, a neighbor's door slamming shut, the usual cacophony of suburban life we lived on a main road, and the sounds of traffic were a constant, familiar backdrop to our lives. I went back to the computer, but my focus was gone. The sense of unease that Abby's barking had ignited lingered, a small, cold knot in the pit of my stomach. Over the next 5 minutes, the feeling intensified. I kept hearing things, or at least I thought I did. A faint rustling in the bushes outside, a soft thud against the side of the house. Abby would start and stop barking, her agitation a mirror of my own growing fear. I was about to get up and check the locks for the third time when I heard it, a sound so distinct, so out of place, that it made my blood run cold. A soft, hesitant knock on the living room door. I froze, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. My heart began to pound a frantic, heavy rhythm against my ribs. I crept back into the living room, my every movement slow and deliberate. Abby was at my side, a low growl rumbling in her chest. I stared at the door, my mind racing. I was too scared to look through the peephole, terrified of what I might see on the other side, a distorted, monstrous face staring back at me. I double-checked the deadbolt, my hand trembling, and was about to retreat back to the relative safety of the computer room when a new sound echoed through the house, knocking, but this time it was coming from the side door. My heart fluttered. A frantic, trapped bird in my chest. What was happening? Was it my parents? Had they gotten locked out? But why would they be knocking on the side door, and why wouldn't they just call me? The questions swirled in my mind, each one more terrifying than the last, before I could even begin to process the implications. Another sound, more sinister than the knocking, reached my ears. The sound of a doorknob being jiggled, of metal scraping against metal, coming from the basement. Our basement was a dark subterranean space, its entrance hidden from view on the outside of the house. To get to it, you had to walk around the entire property, into the backyard, and under the deck. It wasn't a place you would stumble upon by accident. You would have to know it was there, or be very, very determined to find a way in. The realization that someone was systematically testing every point of entry into the house sent a wave of pure and adulterated terror through me. Abby was now in a frenzy, running from room to room, her barks a frantic, desperate alarm. It felt like we were under siege, the house a fortress with its walls slowly being breached. The noises from the basement grew louder, more insistent. It sounded like someone was trying to pry the door open, the wood groaning in protest. And then, as suddenly as it began, the noise stopped. A profound, terrifying silence descended upon the house. I stood frozen in the middle of the living room, my breath held, my ears straining for the next sound, and then it came. A quick, sharp, whip-like sound, followed by a maniacal, guttural growl. Abby. She had flown down the basement stairs, a black and furry missile of protective rage. Abby was the sweetest, most gentle dog I had ever known. I had never heard her make a sound like that before. It was the sound of a creature pushed to its absolute limit, a sound of pure, primal fury. I was frozen in place, a statue carved from fear, for what felt like an eternity. Then, my survival instinct, long dormant, finally kicked in. A new silence had fallen, a silence that was even more terrifying than the one before. Abby had stopped barking. Abby. I called out, my voice a weak, trembling whisper. No response. I flew into action. I ran to the basement door, slammed it shut, and threw the bolt. I grabbed the cordless phone from the kitchen wall, my mind a chaotic blur. I didn't have a cell phone yet, a fact that suddenly felt like a catastrophic oversight. With Abby's whereabouts unknown, I ran to my parents' bedroom, to the one place in the house where I knew I could find a weapon. My dad kept a handgun in a locked box in their closet. I fumbled with the key, my hand shaking so violently that it took me several attempts to open it. I sat there, on the floor of my parents' closet, the cold, heavy weight of the gun in my hands, my thumb hovering over the 911 button on the phone. And then, I heard it. The sound of the front door opening. Abby, who I had presumed was either injured or worse in the basement, suddenly sprinted out of the darkness of the hallway, her tail wagging. No, Abby, no, I screamed, thinking the intruder had finally gotten in. But then I heard them, the familiar, comforting sound of my parents' voices. I ran out of the closet, the gun still clutched in my hand, and into the living room. The sight that greeted me was so jarringly normal that it felt surreal. My parents were petting a very happy, very alive Abby. Their faces etched with confusion as they looked at me, a wild-eyed, gun-wielding lunatic. I spent the next 10 minutes recounting the horrifying events of the night, my words tumbling out in a torrent of fear and relief. My mom was horrified, her face pale with shock. My dad, his face a mask of grim determination, spent the next hour searching every inch of the house, inside and out, his own gun in hand. We found nothing. The doors were all locked, the windows all secure. There was no sign of a forced entry, no indication that anyone had been there at all. I didn't sleep that night, my mind replaying the sounds, the fear over and over again. The next afternoon there was a knock on the front door. My heart immediately leaped into my throat, and I instinctively darted into the kitchen, out of sight. My dad answered the door. I heard a familiar voice, a voice that always made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It was my Uncle Pete. Uncle Pete was a creep. There's no other word for it. He was my aunt's husband, a man who oozed a kind of smarmy, insincere charm that I had always found deeply unsettling. He had a way of looking at you, a way of letting his hand linger on your shoulder for just a second too long. That made my skin crawl. He was a narcissist and a bully, and he treated my aunt and my cousin, Kate, with a casual cruelty that was painful to watch. I played softball, and so did Kate, who was a few years younger than me. I loved my cousin and felt a profound sense of pity for her, so I would often help her with her pitching and fielding. From my hiding place in the kitchen, I could hear my uncle's voice, a sickeningly cheerful sound that was so at odds with the terror of the previous night. "I tried to stop by last night to drop this off," he said, "but no one was home, I guess." My dad's response was a low, guttural sound that I couldn't quite make out. A few moments later, I heard the front door slam shut with a violent, final thud. My mum and I emerged from the kitchen to find my dad standing in the foyer, his face quivering with a rage so intense that it was almost frightening to behold. He explained that it had been Uncle Pete. He had been the one stomping around the house, the one knocking on the doors, the one trying to get into the basement. He handed me an envelope. Inside was a generic greeting card and a $20 gift card to a sporting goods store. A thank you for helping Kate with her softball lessons, a night of pure, unadulterated terror, all at the hands of my creepy uncle. My dad had, in no uncertain terms, threatened him, telling him to never set foot on our property again. We never saw much of him after that. My aunt eventually found the courage to leave him a few years later. Looking back, I am grateful that I found out who was behind the incident. The not knowing, the wondering if it was a burglar or a ghost or something far worse, would have been a special kind of torture. And I am eternally grateful for Abby, my brave, loyal protector. She had undoubtedly scared him off when he was trying to get into the basement. But even with the closure, I am still left with a host of unsettling questions. What was he thinking? Why did he feel the need to drop off a gift card in the middle of the night? Why didn't he just call? And the most terrifying question of all, the one that still keeps me up at night sometimes, is what would have happened if he had gotten inside? What were his real intentions? It's a question I'm glad I'll never have the answer to.